The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the second day of this January 2024 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. The Search for the Holy Grail is a classic tale that has a number of different versions of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table searching for a mysterious grail. There's another version of that, and that is that it is the chalice that Jesus used in the Last Supper. At any rate, there are many cultures that have such search, and so it is in Zen as well. In Zen, it's the search for enlightenment, and I'd like to speak to that. In the old days, and even more recently, it's been assumed that you sit down on your cushion and you do a few moments of zazen, or maybe an hour or two, and you'll be enlightened. You'll be home free, and you won't ever have to do anything difficult again, because it'll all be laid out in front of you with no problems. Well, that's quite a myth, and not exactly true. There are many tales of young enthusiasts sitting down on the cushion in their room somewhere and vowing not to get up until they've achieved an awakening, just as the Buddha had done. The only thing is, the Buddha had done a lot of work ahead of time. He'd done 6 years of ascetic practice, and when he realized that that wasn't going to work and he was just going to lose his life in the process, he changed his direction and sat down under the Bo tree, which is now called the Tree of Enlightenment, in Bodh Gaya, India, and vowed not to get up until he had achieved his goals, which was to find out what life was about. And was it only getting born, getting sick, getting old, and dying? Wasn't there something more? And there is something of that sense in pretty much everybody that's born. For some people, without any contact to a spiritual practice or anything else like that, because it doesn't necessarily require a spiritual practice, although it does require a wordless search. They don't realize that that's what it requires, and instead get sidetracked into finding that supposed joy and freedom through drugs, alcohol, sex, parties, and other things, gambling. And sometimes people just spend their whole lives chasing it, trying to find that elusive joy, that elusive freedom. Unfortunately, chasing it in the wrong directions. But for those people fortunate enough to recognize that that's not going to work, there is Zen practice, and there are also various practices in other religions, other spiritual religions. And in fact, I would say that the vision quest in the Native American cultures is a version of that search, that spiritual search for, we can't name it because it's beyond words. So what is it that we're seeking? There's often, as part of that search, a sense that there's something missing in our life. There was a British man who was highly successful in work. He was still quite young, and it was quite successful. He had a flat in the best part of London, and he went to many parties where he was quite popular. He had an incredible job and high status. And one day, in the middle of a party, he realized there was something missing. And so he answered an ad, of all things, in a London newspaper that advertised a week of vacation in a Japanese Buddhist monastery in Japan. And without knowing anything more about it, he got himself a ticket and took off and spent his week in a temple in Japan and doing meditation. And when he wasn't doing meditation or part of the rest of the schedule, he would hang out in the temple's garden. And Buddhist temple gardens are famous in Japan. There is such a vibe in them. There's such presence, it's not anything you can really put your finger on other than you want to be there. And it's there because there has been so much practice, meditation practice in many cases, tending the garden in other cases, or both. And so these temples are imbued with a very special, focused energy. That energy is what brought Roshi Kapleau to return to Japan after taking some courses with E.T. Suzuki at Columbia University. He'd been to Japan as a court reporter, and I don't remember whether he was the head court reporter there or at Nuremberg. Either way, he was pretty high up in the ranks, and so he was there in Japan. And when he was not in court, taking notes and documenting what was said, he would go and hang out in temple gardens. He was drawn to that. He was a very sensitive human being, very sensitive to energy. So this British man was doing the same thing, and he recognized that there was a Japanese man who was practicing shakuhachi, the bamboo flute, in that same garden, and he was entranced by it. He came and listened, and then he actually connected with a man who, it turns out, was a flute master, and bought himself a bamboo flute after the retreat was over, or the vacation was over, and started practicing it. He went back to London and decided to go back to Japan again, and this time with his, I think she was his wife, and sort of take up residence there, at least for the time being, and take lessons in playing the shakuhachi from this very expert. He continued to be absorbed in this work, and eventually came to know a practice called Suizen, which is a practice of playing the shakuhachi so extensively and anonymously, because monks who are Suizen have a basket covering their head, which keeps them anonymous. There are openings for the eyes, and obviously an opening in the mouth so you could play the shakuhachi. And they will play for hours and hours and hours a day, and this brings them to a place of deep let go. So this British man decided that he was going to do some Suizen on his own, and for 6 hours straight, every day for several weeks, he went up into the mountain and just played the shakuhachi, just practiced the shakuhachi all those hours without gap. When he went back to his master for his next lesson, the master was quite impressed by his deepening of his ability to play. And eventually, the British man had a number of experiences, gaining some level of fame in Japan for playing the shakuhachi, including being invited to play for some circumstance by the mafia. He wasn't sure when he got the invitation. He wasn't sure when he got the invitation whether if he played in a way that didn't satisfy the mafia, the yakuza, what his fate would be. But he also recognized that it was not an invitation that he could refuse. So he went and he played, and they loved it, and they gave him a tremendous amount of money, which surprised him, and so on and so forth. Last I knew, this man was living in British Columbia and teaching shakuhachi. He had found his grail. In Zen, of course, our mythical grail is enlightenment. Enlightenment, kensho, which means seeing into the nature of reality. Satori, which is a deeper experience. Awakening, there are many terms for it. And it takes place with ongoing, serious, deep, committed Zen practice. Deep questioning. It doesn't necessarily require Zen practice per se, but it does require a wordless questioning. And I think here of a student of mine in California, Fugen, who, as a child, asked his mother who he was and where he'd come from. He started doing this when he was 2 or 3 years old. And whatever she answered, he realized she didn't know. So he kept on. It was really a significant quest for him. He wanted to know. And when he was about 4 or 5, he realized that he was perfect, just as he was. That's how he put it to me. And it was an amazing experience, particularly given his family. He had a sister who seemed to escape the challenges that he met, but he was psychologically as well as physically abused by his mother and his father, both. And yet, having had that experience of understanding that he was perfect regardless, kept him going for the rest of his life, actually. And unfortunately, he died. He was vastly overweight and also a smoker. And he died of a heart attack when he was, I think, about 49 years old. On top of that, his parents got into taking drugs from Mexico and selling them in the States. His father's original business was to go down to Mexico and buy empty oil drums and bring them back and resell them in the States. But somebody told him it would be a really cool thing, perfect hideaway, if he would fill those oil drums with drugs, illicit drugs, and bring them back. And eventually he was caught, and he and his wife both were put into federal prison. At that time, Fugen was 17 years old. His sister was a little older and basically bought the house so that they would have it. And Fugen, who had gotten into drugs himself, cold turkeyed off the drugs. It was kind of amazing that he could do that, but he couldn't quit cigarettes. The damage was done, however, by the abuse. And so when he came to Hidden Valley Zen Center, he was loud and acting basically the way he'd been taught by his parents to act, verbally abusive, and so on and so forth. And in fact, 2 of the members at Hidden Valley Zen Center had said, either he goes or I go. But I explained his background, and they were willing to accept some time before they enabled that decision. And gradually over time, with the honor that we were giving him, because at heart he was quite a lovely, caring human being. He had just been exposed to the wrong kind of behavior, and we learn based on our environment how to be. And over time, he became the person he was meant to be, as his aunt shared with me at his funeral. The transition of this man was quite wonderful. And it was because he had had that questioning when he was a small child. He persisted, which is quite something because he was so young. And he discovered the Grail within himself. We can also do the same thing, and hopefully we have not had the same growing up experiences. But even if we have, like Fugen, we can realize it. So what is awakening? And how do we get there? It is literally letting go of the conditioning and the assumptions around it that we developed as we were growing up, including a sense of being somebody that we needed to protect, that would get embarrassed under the wrong circumstances, that we cling to because it seems protection for us. What are we if we are not that person that we think we are? What are we if we are not the person that is a klutz or is inept or is particularly proficient in something? We don't know until we find out. Although hearing Fugen's story gives you a hint. When we let go of this idea, sense of being that seems to be rock hard and drive our life, determine our reactions to situations, and in fact, more than that, it sees situations through a filter based on its own experiences, rather than a clear understanding of what's happening. And so we react to situations. We get embarrassed. We get angry. We get upset. And are they accurate? Not necessarily so. In fact, in large part, they're not. Yet, they're heavy. They're like having an albatross around our neck because we're prisoner to them, really, prisoner to that misperception that we have. And so we do react to things that we ordinarily wouldn't if we were clear-sighted. This is what makes Zen practice a challenge, because we don't realize that we are influenced by this self-image, by this history of what we experienced growing up. And if we don't hang on to it, if we don't live out of it, if we don't react as it demands, who are we? How are we going to know how to act? How are we going to know how to live? Are we going to just melt into oblivion? And so there's a great deal of fear that comes up with the potential of letting go or seeing through even that self-image. Yet, in order to come to awakening, which means to be free, to not have to have a ground under our feet, to not be anchored into this misperception of a self-image, and instead to be free to move as circumstance really asks us to. Not to knee-jerk in reaction to something, but to clearly, openly, freely respond to what's going on. There's such freedom in this. And that's what calls to us, really. That sense that there's something more. That sense that we're missing something. That sense that something's not quite right in our life. And indeed, as long as we're caught in delusion and greed and anger, we will be missing something vital, which actually is built in. That's the irony of it. We are this wondrous beingness of the universe. But because of our conditioning, we've learned how to act and believe otherwise. This is why it is so difficult. This is why it can be frustrating. It can take a long time. We can encounter fear. We can encounter whatever conclusions we made about ourselves through that conditioning, which we tightly hold on to. And it's about letting all of that go, seeing through it. That's what Kensho really means. is seeing through to some level of reality. So recognize that coming to awakening can take a long time, but every minute spent working on it is incredibly worth it. And step by step, what is it they say? A journey of 100 miles or 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And of course, then the next step has to follow. But it is the same for Zen practice. We get discouraged. We think it's not going to work. Sometimes we stop believing in the teacher, stop believing in the practice. But if we persist, we will become increasingly free as we work through where we're caught. That's it in a nutshell. And those people who have experienced true awakening would never go back. That said, also, there are degrees of awakening. One doesn't normally go all the way to the bottom of coming to awakening at the first Kensho. That's why Kensho is what it is, a seeing into the nature of reality. It's not a complete immersion in it. And so we have to work past the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, however many it takes, experience of awakening before we can truly be free. And then also, as part of that, we need to do the long maturation, because the long maturation begins to release our habit patterns of being caught in certain behavior patterns so that we can live what we have experienced and we're not caught. There are, in the old days when people just assumed that all you had to do was have a Kensho and you're home free, that long maturation was ignored. I'm not quite sure why, because it was taught at least by Torei Enji in the 18th century. He was a Dharma successor of Hakuin. Somewhere along the way, it didn't get completely included in the practice instructions in at least Japanese Zen. And so in the beginning, in the early years of Zen, people could have some level of Kensho, enough that they could work on subsequent koans and work their way through the subsequent koans and still be acting in the same old shitty ways. This is why the long maturation is so essential. Because if you've had a Kensho experience and you're still caught in your stuff and acting it out, it's not really a Kensho experience. It's an idea, and maybe you've had a brief experience of freedom, but it's not going to operate in your life until you work on that long maturation. And recognize, and work with letting go, processing through the different places, the different ways we're caught in greed, anger, and delusion. It can take lifetimes. Technically, well, I don't know if it's really technically, but theoretically anyway, the Buddha was working on it for 6 lifetimes before he came to his profound awakening, at which point he was no longer creating karma. Because as soon as he experienced something, he was responding in a way that was let go, and so there were no traces dragging along. And he was not creating new karma. We can get there too. All of us have no doubt been working on this for some time. So you already have a start. To keep going is so important. Now that you have had some level of work in that direction, the alternative is that whatever work you've done in that direction before is going to fade, as it did with a man who was in the invasion of Normandy in the Second World War and returned to New York City, where he lived, and couldn't even begin to do anything but wander the streets in a kind of a daze, asking inwardly, or wondering inwardly, because I'm sure it was before, but without any words, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there such brutality? Why is there such horror? And after 6 months, he'd been so absorbed in it, and that's a clue, everyone. You don't just go in for your 2-hour evening sitting and go back home and the next time go back in and then go back home. It's a persistent, steady persistence that will get you there, like it was for this man. And he had an opening experience. 20 years later, it had faded because he had no way to keep it going or to deepen it. And he went to visit Roshi Keplo on somebody's advice. Roshi told him that if he went to doing Zazen, it would come back to life for him. But Roshi said he never saw the man again. And that was in a period of time when there were very, very few Zen teachers in the United States. So we have to do that ongoing work. If we don't, as I said, it's going to fade, whatever insights we've gotten. And it is very tempting to let it fade. It's very tempting to stop doing practice. I know people who were actually training side by side with me at the Rochester Zen Center in the old days who have stopped doing Zazen. And I feel bad about it because at least one of them had gone on to subsequent koans, so they'd had some level of insight, but they hadn't continued it. To sit down, make the commitment, recognizing that it's going to be ups and downs for quite a while, but as you plow on, it will get deeper, it will get easier, although you'll have a period of time where you're really going through the muck. And Roshi Kapleau likened it to trying to swim through wet cement. In my own life, I also entered a time when I didn't believe in the teacher and went to sesshins where I felt absolutely no interest in doing the practice. But somewhere deep within me was a true need to do it. And after a certain interaction with the Roshi, which he wouldn't speak to me and about this problem, and when I was not accepted to the next sesshin in Rochester, I realized I really did want to come to awakening. Before that, it felt quite real that I had no interest in it. So that was a long time ago, and obviously I've persisted, and I hope you will too. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.